Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's First Amendment Friday. I'll get back to your phone calls and your emails shortly, but I've got to get a little medical advice from Dr. Kevin Pham, who's a contributor to the Daily Signal and a former graduate fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Pham, welcome back to the program, and tell us, is hydroxychloroquine safe for most patients?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure being back. Second, hydroxychloroquine is generally safe for most people who are ultimately prescribed it. It's been in use for several decades now, over 50 years now it's been in use, hydroxychloroquine, that is. Chloroquine has been used for even longer, and both of those are based on quinine, which is boiled out of a bark in South America, and that's been in use for hundreds of years now. So as a drug, it's very safe as far as drugs go, but it's also important to remember there are no benign drugs. All drugs have side effects. So some people are going to have adverse reactions to this drug. That's just how drugs work in general.
All right, before we get into some new developments that I want to ask you about, let's talk about this. Nancy Pelosi comes out the day after Donald Trump, in full transparency, says, look, I've been taking it prophylactically for the last couple of weeks. I don't think he actually said prophylactically, but my understanding is he doesn't have the China virus, and he's taking this as a way to perhaps make it less likely, and I want to get into that as well. But Nancy Pelosi says, well, for his age group, she's, I think, 6 years older than he is, and his weight group, well, she does look like a stick compared to the president. He carries some extra pounds, but she described him as morbidly obese and says he shouldn't be taking it, in her expert medical opinion. Would you agree with Dr. Pelosi on that?
No, I would have to disagree with her on that point, as neither of those things are particular risk factors for some of the side effects of hydroxychloroquine. We're mostly looking at heart conditions, and you might say there's an association with obesity and heart conditions, but that would be a risk factor for a risk factor, so therefore it's not a risk factor. And so she's being highly unhelpful and just turning this into a partisan exercise, the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. It may work, it may not work, but what it's certainly not is something that should be thrown around as a partisan weapon.
No, and when she's worried about the kind of things that would make hydroxychloroquine not a big deal or not a smart thing to do, Dr. Pham, she's talking about this QT interval problem that has to do with the signaling that keeps your ticker ticking in the right way, and that's not necessarily a fat guy thing, is it? That could be a skinny runner type who's got a QT interval problem, isn't it?
Yeah, the long QT syndrome is not specific to any group of people. It more has to do with the heart health of a person. And it could be a person who's generally healthy. If their heart may have some kind of condition that predisposes them to having a longer QT, and if they're taking this drug, that QT may elongate. Just to review what a QT interval is, when you look at one of those, the EKG readings, that line that's drawn, the squiggly line, from beginning to end, there's an interval called the PQRST interval, and then between the P and the Q is between the Q and the T actually is what we're worried about here. If that starts to elongate, then that predisposes the person's heart to entering an arrhythmia, and these arrhythmias that can arise from it, they can be potentially lethal, which is why we're concerned about it. But again, this is well understood and it's well controlled, and there's no doctor going to prescribe hydroxychloroquine to somebody who already has a long QT.
Which means that I'm guessing I've advanced the theory, no evidence to support it, Dr. Pham, but I would say that Donald Trump probably has the best medical care in the world available to him. Now, whether he listens to his doctor every time, who knows? I've known doctor friends of mine who weren't very good patients, and they were non-compliant, as you guys call them. In fact, one of them sadly passed away because he was a doctor who wouldn't do what his own doctor told him to do. And it was a sad situation, but hey, it's a choice, right? So let me ask you the more important question, and that is, there's a term prophylactically, right? You know, and I know people think of prophylactics, but you take something prophylactically. You take something to prevent getting something else. Is there any indication that hydroxychloroquine is a good prophylactic for coronavirus?
For coronavirus, there's not any hard evidence just yet, but as a prophylactic for something else like malaria, then it does work very well as a prophylaxis because it builds up levels in the body, and then it has a long half-life. So when you take it, once you've built up that level, it stays in the body for a relatively long amount of time, which means that it's good for, if it does prevent a viral infection or a parasitic infection, then it's pretty good for that purpose because it'll stay in the body for a while. As far as if it works prophylactically against the COVID-19 disease, there's studies being done to see if that works. And one study has 45 participants. It's not going to tell us too much, but it'll be good baseline information. There's another study that's going on right now that has either 1,000 or several thousand participants, and they're still recruiting. That's going to take some time. But, it is something that's being looked at and it's being considered. So the president is not necessarily wrong in this. I don't know if it's going to be much benefit, but he's not wrong in this. And just in a quick point, too, in India, the equivalent of their NIH is they've approved it for healthcare workers or people on the front lines who are exposed to people. They're using that as a prophylaxis for COVID-19 already.
Hey, smart move, doctor. That's where I was going next, because I understand that not just the India study or the India approval for frontline workers, but I understand there are quite a number of medical professionals here in America who, along with their families, have been taking this for the last couple of months because they believe it's a prophylactic.
Right, for the same reason that it works well in managing lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, then it would work well as a prophylaxis, like I was talking about, that long half-life. And so if there's some evidence that it does work, then I don't see a reason why doctors wouldn't use it other than to preserve the drug supplies for people who have an active need for it. But if there's sufficient supplies, and supply has been ramping up lately, if there's sufficient supplies, I can understand why doctors would want to use it. Again, I don't know that I would necessarily believe that it has an effect, but if you're risking your family's life, then I can see people taking that risk, especially when the side effects are fairly rare and pretty well understood.
I'm always tempted to get into the weeds with you because I find medicine fascinating, but if the thing that hydroxychloroquine does in your body, what's the mechanism by which it is good for fighting off things like malaria? And is there an argument to be made that that same mechanism might work against something like COVID-19?
Potentially. The mechanism of action for hydroxychloroquine is multifold. One of the things that they think is actually the main effect it's having against viruses is that it opens up zinc channels, and then the zinc is able to enter the cells, which inhibits the cell replication of the virus inside of the cell. And people think that, or a lot of researchers think that might be how it's working. Another effect that I think might be one of the mechanisms of actions in the COVID-19 is that it also has an anti-inflammatory action. It's not quite immunosuppressing, but it does prevent some levels of inflammation. And as we've seen, inflammation is causing a lot of the mortality in some ICUs. So if that's the case, then I can see why it's decreasing mortality in some cases.
That's what I was curious about, because the inflammatory side of it, and zinc is another one that's drawn everybody's attention. But if COVID-19 gets in my lungs, for some patients, it causes really terrible inflammation. People described lungs that felt like they were on fire, or lungs that felt like they were being slashed apart with sharp knives. And really painful stuff to where you couldn't hold your breath for 10 seconds. If it tamps down that effect in your lungs, then that means you won't end up in as much respiratory distress if it does come after you. Is that the idea?
That's mostly the idea. It's just the anti-inflammatory effects of hydroxychloroquine is not that great. It's not extremely powerful. So a lot of the late use hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19, I think it's probably not. It's not doing a lot when the disease is already advanced so far. And so I think some of these studies that are showing increased mortality with hydroxychloroquine, I think it would probably be because of that. So just the fact that it's being used later on in the disease course, whereas it would be most effective earlier in the disease course to prevent the hyperinflammatory response.
All right, so I got to ask you, Dr. Pham, are you taking it right now?
I am not. I haven't seen enough evidence to really suggest that it's working, and I don't think I'm at much risk of developing either severe disease. And I take a lot of precautions, so I don't think I'm going to get infected anytime soon. But if I do, I'm in a low risk group, so.
Yeah, but you have heard some of your colleagues doing it, yes?
No, actually, I have not.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
I know
that
people
says
who
a
know
lot.
people. I know people who know people, but I don't know people directly who are using it for prophylactic use.
Dr. Pham, have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and thanks so much for taking the time with me on a Friday night.
Yeah, absolutely. You too.
That's Dr. Kevin Pham.